and welcome to Data Matters Podcast, brought to you by Matatika, the simpler, smarter data platform that doesn't lock you in. In this podcast, we get into the bits and bytes of modern data, uncovering the stories from you, today's data leaders. Hosted by me, Aaron Phethean. So without further ado, let's dive in.
Today we're joined by Phil Thirlwell, who's just left the corporate world to start his own fractional data leader role. And I think he's got some really interesting point of views on what customers need, what teams need, and the technologies that is needed to achieve that. So without further ado, let's dive in. Hello, Phil. Welcome to the show. Absolutely delighted to have you on. You're just leaving the world of corporate, head of data and entering the brave new domain of doing your own thing and finding your own clients. And super excited to hear about what you've done in the past and kind of what the future looks like. So, welcome. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
That's cool.
It's just such an exciting time right now with data and AI really disrupting every industry. But at the same time, the opportunity is massive, right? I've worked sort of the last 9 years in fintech, but I've made the jump to interim and fractional. And the reason there really is that most companies don't need a full-time CDAO on the payroll. They need specialist skills, right, on demand, and someone who can meet them where they are, solve the problems, and then without the overhead, really, of a perm hire.
Yeah, exactly. Like you said, there are tons of companies at a size where having someone very experienced on the team all the time doesn't really make sense. So that's going to be awesome to dive into that. And it's obviously a bit of a new experience, and some people have considered it for themselves. So I'm quite keen to dig into that. I think when we were chatting before in a couple of our pre-calls, we're thinking actually about what are the kind of main challenges for companies, and so I think we'll dig into that for everyone listening. That will kind of be the first stop. Second area that we're kind of digging into is kind of technology and platforming and how people spend their time. And then I think there's a sort of still relevant AI question and what's happening that we intend to discuss. So let's dive into the kind of corporate world and what companies need. Phil, if you could give us your opinion on what a kind of typical mid-sized company that perhaps doesn't get the most out of their data team looks like and what they could be doing better.
Yeah, it really comes back to getting the value out of the data. It's ultimately, I think our job as data leaders is getting the right information to the right people or process these days at the right time, right? To make a decision that's going to impact the business. That's ultimately what it boils down to. But there's a number of obstacles that get in the way of that. I guess that's kind of what we want to move on to as our first topic.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Like it seems like such a simple task. I met with someone yesterday. Actually, I was trying to sort of explain our proposition, and the sort of question came up. They were very much on the analytics side of things, and I'm like, well, why is this even a challenge? Like getting the data in the right place to understand what's going on. It can feel very far away from people. In your experience, why is it a challenge to bring data together and do these sort of what in this day and age should be a solved problem?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. I think historically in data we haven't done a great job of understanding what the outcome is, right? There's been a lot of investment to building pretty data models, funneling loads of data into a data lake, but not really thinking about what's the problem space here or where's the opportunity that we're going to drive with that data.
Mm-hmm.
And in many ways, I think in data we've followed suit of software engineering. Software engineering, I think, is kind of set the standards with DevSecOps and agile ways of working. And I think we've always been slightly behind that curve from a data perspective.
Yeah, I agree. What I mean. I definitely agree with that perspective.
We've seen it. It's in data ops, ML ops. That came afterwards, and I still think a lot of teams aren't really putting it into practice in the best way. So it's really reframing what you think when you deliver a data project, right? Because often it's not clear what the problem is to begin with, right? You get a question or you get a problem statement that isn't, it's really a symptom rather than the problem. But taking that kind of structured approach, right, and really thinking, okay, if I'm going to, deliver a dashboard, deliver a model, and treating that as a product rather than kind of a project that's unbounded, I think that leads to better outcomes when it comes to delivering.
That you've touched on quite a few things there. That kind of need to think about the organization up front, definitely see as a positive for lots of organizations. And that kind of product scoping that you're just discussing, again, that to me is like feels incredibly valuable because you're not responding anymore. You're kind of framing and figuring out what the organization needs with a lot more focus. And that's relatively recent, really. I wonder if what advice you'd give people to take on that approach. Like how could they go from the kind of person turning up at their desk asking for a dashboard to more structured conversation around what is the product for the organization or products for the organization?
Yeah, it's a good question, and you still see it a lot, right? That happens. It's kind of it feels good to be answering those questions because it feels like you're giving it immediate value, right? But you're not really producing scalable solutions that are maybe getting to the heart of the problem. For me, it's really around how you structure the data capability in terms of your operating model. I think it's a flip in that operating model, in a flip in thinking. I think what's worked for me in previous sort of leading data and AI in fintech is taking the lead from the software engineering business and looking at an agile delivery approach. So rather than potentially having a Kanban board where you kind of working stuff through and okay, you may be limiting your whip, so you don't have too much on, but you essentially just whoever shouts loudest, they get the next piece. It's really thinking, okay, what we're going to deliver in the next 3 months, and let's break that down into deliverables so you can kind of continuously be showing impact. And it forces, I think, you to think things through before you get started and work more closely with stakeholders on getting to the heart of the outcomes that they need, so you can you deliver things with less rework, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's one mistake I've seen time and again is that the adoption of an agile approach doesn't mean there's no plan or no overall direction. In fact, it just helps you choose much more robustly what it is important to work on, and you kind of get away from that. I think some people describe it as firefighting, but actually, it can feel quite good, like you said, to solve someone's problem. People get drawn to like fixing small things is actually quite easy and a bit of a dopamine hit at the same time.
It is. That's exactly what it is.
Yeah, so it's a really good point of view. So then, if you take the organizational, we've looked out a little bit as the data team. If you take the organizational point of view for a second, what do you think the organization wants from their data team that they're perhaps not getting?
What they want and what they need isn't always the same thing, right? In many ways, they want that, right? They want the instant response. They just want the answer. It's often the case, right? But what they need from the data team is really a partner that will challenge them and kind of help them get to the root cause and get to the decisions that matter for the business. And I think those are two different things. There are a level of standards, right, that stakeholders need. They need to be able to trust in the data. As soon as you lose that, you've lost. I guess you've lost the game, right? It's game over. And they need to be able to understand the products and use the products. And I think that comes to literacy. Not everyone's gonna be able to interpret the same sort of outcomes, right? If it's going to a data science team that they want really well labeled sort of wide data set, but maybe you finance a HR, finance maybe they want some tabular data, HR, they just want some graphs that kind of tell them where they need to focus, and being able to kind of understand that and deliver outcomes that your stakeholders can actually use and make decisions off is a really important part of it.
Yeah. I actually really like that link to the kind of product view of the world. And actually the product might not be the same for everyone. Thinking of data and where it comes from and its freshness is certainly one aspect. But like different teams, like you said, might need something more visual, might need something more, this is directional. Other teams might need something much more highly accurate and feeds into their work in some way. So yeah, that actually thinking about the people and the product is definitely can see that. One of the things that we chatted about actually was that it still seems a problem that organizations have gazillions of dashboards, and that seems to be the main output from the data team. I wonder, in your experience, how do you solve that? And do companies need hundreds of dashboards? What does kind of good look like in that kind of more visual space?
Yeah, I think it's definitely more is less when it comes to dashboards and even KPIs. They cease to be key performance indicators if you've got too many of them, right?
Yeah.
But I think particularly in larger businesses that kind of it does you do get that sprawl, and that's something that should be addressed. In most cases, I think when at one point at FIS there was 600 odd Power BI dashboards. For a fact that they're not all getting updated. That probably some of the people that have built them have no longer with the business, but they're still out there. People can who've got the link can get that data, maybe misuse that data if it's not accurate and reliable. So I think kind of having an end of life to a dashboard is back to that product ideas, that's really important. And if a new product gets created that does the job or overlaps with another one, then it's a decision: is this still required? Is this still useful? I think one of the mistakes that I've made in the past is just pulling the plug without looking at the user base, though, because you might think, oh well, this dashboard's all, but if you're not monitoring who's actually looking at it, you might have hundreds of users still who are getting value from it. And okay, you've launched a new dashboard that does a job in a better way, but you've got to communicate that out, right? So that's an important piece of it.
That sounds like a painful lesson learned, and probably a good bit of advice for anyone listening. I like the product end of life concept as applied to that as well. And I think that change is always really hard, like for anyone. They don't necessarily want it, and they don't necessarily get that the new and better version is new and better for them. Yeah, I think there's quite a few aspects there that feel quite challenging for data teams. One thing I'd like to revisit is the kind of, I think you mentioned it briefly, the kind of consulting or trusted advisor. Or so if you're heading up a data team, you've got to build a relationship with the organization to establish those KPIs. And I think I see quite often they would like that to be a kind of two-way conversation. Like what are key? What are the metrics that are key to indicators for us? And perhaps the organization as a whole is not as literate about what's going on for them. I wonder where you could advise people to start. It seems like the dashboard sprawl is happening and they're lacking KPIs. Where can they start to establish what's important?
Yeah, I think it's got to be, you've got to co-develop these things. If I look back to when I started at yes, the challenge was around engineering metrics, and in kind of having engineering metrics that made sense to the board, but also could be, that made sense to the scrum teams, the development teams on the ground. So that kind of thread runs all the way from top to bottom. And really, there's obviously industry standards, so that's a good place to start. But every organization is different, and what we found really got this sort of engagement. It got people engaged in actually using the dashboards, using the KPIs to drive decisions, was kind of when it came to the definition of how it would be calculated at a technical level from the tool, involving the development teams, the development leaders in that process. So it was kind of co-owned by them. And I think why that was so successful was because by working with them, obviously they felt invested, they felt they were part of the process, but
Yeah.
also from a governance point of view, they knew how it was calculated in the tool. So they knew we have to update this, when we go through this part of the process, and they knew which fields mattered. And at that time we were using Rally. They knew as they were going through their development process, what they should be updating, what they should be filling out. And that just obviously just gets it, made sure the data quality was in a good spot, so that the KPIs that were coming out of it were even
Actually
more useful. So,
sensible,
yeah.
I do see that as a pretty big part of defining that product or what an organization needs to do better. I think there's a lot of frustration I see in people are inputting things or creating things, but not necessarily recognizing that they are creating a data point. They are creating a piece of information that's going to feed into some decision or something that's important. You can get into these situations where they're just capturing loads of things, and most of them don't feed anything anymore. Or that why on earth are they capturing that rather? And so, actually, if I think back to one of my first jobs, I worked in a supermarket, and that you're capturing things. It feels like for the sake of it. And actually, as time goes on, I'm sort of more and more convinced that I was. I was literally just doing these things because it seemed like a good thing to measure once, and it's just not anymore. So actually, looking at that whole process with the individuals who actually create the data sounds like sound advice. The other thing you mentioned was
think,
kind of the tools. Oh, sorry, go on. You.
No, I was going to say, like, on that point, there's so many systems and so many fields and custom fields that you can have. Like, you can't govern everything. So really, you should be focusing on the ones that matter, right? You don't need to worry about having every field inputted to a certain level of quality. It's just which ones are most important. Let's focus on those ones.
And they probably turn into your tests and the ones that you monitor more closely and checking the values of, whereas all those dozens of other custom fields that capture something for a particular project, maybe don't worry about them.
Yeah, don't worry about it. If they want to use, if that works for that Scrum team, great. But we're not gonna try and set a standard across the enterprise.
And that's, I suppose that's the big difference, isn't it? A data team for the enterprise is really about the whole picture. Whereas a team that needs an operational report and needs to track something for themselves and their own productivity, well, that's great too. They can do that.
Absolutely, both valid.
So then, you touched on tools briefly, and I suppose yes, people see dashboards or they see the product that the dashboard is in, but there's a ton of stuff that they don't see. And one of the things that experiences you had recently that we were thinking might be quite good to talk about is kind of Microsoft tool set and its sort of suitability for an organization versus other tools. And I think there's two big bits I'd love to touch on. Is like how do organizations decide what fits for them, and then also the kind of what does good look like in the technology at the moment. Where are we headed with that? So maybe starting with the first one. What when your experience with the Fabric? Why was it a good fit for you at FIS and the team there?
Yeah, I think certainly for FIS, Fabric made a great deal of sense. Already the enterprise was all in on Microsoft.
Mm-hmm.
People knew Power BI, people already working in Azure, right, Synapse, etc. And Fabric just kind of brought everything together in a kind of one-stop shop in many ways under the one lake. So for an enterprise like that, I think it's a really good option. Everything's covered. You've got that one relationship with Microsoft, and that can be a good way to go. There's other options though, right? Depending on the business. A lot of businesses maybe on GCP, like on the Google stack. It's less integrated than Fabric, but they've pretty much got everything there if you want to. But what I see a lot of peers doing and a lot of maybe scale up businesses, the smaller businesses doing is kind of picking and choosing their vendors. And that can make sense there as well. Like it really depends on the context of the business. So you maybe you choosing Databricks, maybe you choosing Matatika for your ETL, and maybe using Tableau for your dashboards. that's a valid option. And probably if you're a smaller company, I think it gives you a little bit more control, and it allows you to select vendors that are gonna kind of really get to know your business and build a relationship. Whereas, the Microsofts and Googles of the world, they're probably look at the Fortune 100 and spending most of their
Yeah,
effort there.
they want to focus on the big case studies and the big,
Yeah.
extreme uses of their product. And I definitely would like to think as a vendor that, as a small company, we're really like over delivering on support and, engagement. And, at a certain level, that's like really, really valuable to a company. And, the other thing I kind of fundamentally believe in is the kind of openness of the stack and that kind of technology choice. I guess the trade-off, if I think about the kind of organization that's completely in Microsoft, is that, in theory, it should all work together better. It should all kind of be more seamless. You might lack some of the opportunity to tweak and tune, but that can also be its own problem. Probably another little sort of tangent of that thought is that if I look at two big cloud data warehouses, Databricks has got lots and lots of tuning opportunities. Snowflake, equally good as a product, equally good in the market, has far fewer tuning opportunities. They're supposedly solving exactly the same problem. So you definitely got different approaches there that work, whether the organization's engineering heavy or not. And I think, just coming back to Fabric, it's a relatively, you adopted at the time when it was a new product and it was a new release.
Yeah,
And
very new.
that definitely comes with some pain, always does. Wonder what it
Yeah.
was like as the time went on and sort of where you see it now as a product.
I'm definitely an advocate when it comes to Fabric. I think there's a lot of good features there. It does offer a lot with the one lake, the opportunity to kind of share data products across the enterprise, so you don't have to have everything centralized. You can have different teams that own their own models, own their own data sets, but you can shortcut to them and you can control the security at a row level. You can then kind of, rather than centralizing the governance, you can kind of have that as a federated governance model where
Interesting.
the specialist teams, they own and they're responsible for what comes out of it. But they're also the source of truth. Like there's only one finance. There's only one answer. One of the problems that we had at FIS was that we tried to address with Fabric really was like some basic questions were kind of, you get different answers. You ask how many people work at the business, how many people work in this business area, and you, depending on the definition that finance has, that HR has, that the business have, you get wildly different answers, and that's just not really acceptable at an executive level or any level really. Like you've got to be able to define these things and have a unified.
It is actually really challenging though, isn't it? I mean, it sounds
more so than you think.
Exactly. If you're someone listening that's probably not in the data space, you think, how hard can it be to know how many people work in your department? But there are so many subtleties. Like, are they actually in that department now, or are they working for someone else?
Are they part-time? Are they a contractor? Like it's all of these just layers of complexity that you add into it.
Yeah, definitely. And that's, I would say people and definition of roles is probably far, far simpler than revenue and products and, when revenue is recognizable and all these kind of it is actually, it's quite challenging in any piece of data to really define it, but important and important work for a data team. The other thing that probably the second part is we were chatting earlier about the platform itself and the working on the platform. That's also not the end outcome, but it can demand a lot of time. You're trying to get a benefit as a data team and you can spend all this energy migrating and getting to a technology. I wonder what advice you'd have for people who are perhaps facing a legacy, bunch of technology and need to move on for a reason, or find themselves perhaps spending too much time on the technology stack. What do you think teams should be doing in that area?
Yeah, I think, it's a mistake that has been made over and over again. I think when it came to data warehousing, creating large enterprise data platforms without really connecting with the business. Just, okay, let's structure the data in a way that makes sense from an engineering point of view, but without then doing all of that work up front to ingest and transform the data before you then engage the business and say, right, okay, how are we going to use it? I think it's asking the question of, if you are looking to change platform or modernize the platform, it's what problem are you solving? Like, why are you doing it? And if the answers are because our competitors are doing it, that's not a good answer, right? It has to be relevant to a problem or an opportunity potentially that you want to exploit within the business context. It's not just because that's where the industry is going. Might be still be the right decision, but if you don't understand that and why you're doing it from the outset, you're not going to get the commitment, and you're probably not going to make the right architectural decisions as you go through that migration process.
Yeah, I definitely see that. And where I see projects that have a really clear pain, perhaps a pain, or a really clear goal about what they want to do and that they can't do now, I kind of know that it's going to work, and you've got that focus on what is it that we're doing this for. And then you get some measurables at the end. We achieved it or we didn't. Might be quite binary. Or it might be like we exceeded it or we've saved a bunch of time. And there definitely needs to be reasons to do these things. And the more specific you can get, the better I see the outcomes.
I think, the ROI kind of comes to mind. I think it's a difficult one, but it's important, right? And I think having a clear idea how you're gonna measure that, comes with having a clear idea of where you want to get to. But it's not just about the cost, right? It's not just about savings. There's two components, right? Hopefully there may be some cost. There might actually not be a cost benefit, but there might be, particularly if you've got a lot of bloat. But what is it that by building this new platform, migrating this new platform, what's the additional value that you can create on top of it? And that's part of the equation as well, right?
100%.
That's harder to quantify, and it's really hard to kind of estimate in advance. But I think there's ways of doing it, right? Is back to sort of productize the data. If you need to really be productizing the data, you need to have a measure of success. And that isn't, it's not always immediately like a financial one. It might be increasing NPS. It might be, reducing time to market. What I've sort of found is if you can go to link that to, annual return. No. Let's just cut that. Sorry.
We'll cut this one.
Yeah. I was trying to get to annual recurring revenue, but I was stumbling on my stuff. I did want to make the point on ROI though. Where do we go back to?
You can just start from, if you keep the focus on ARR or annual recurring revenue, or start from, the point about ROI, and then I'll just find a good way to snip that in. And
okay, I'll go again. So yeah, I think ROI it's really important to have that in mind when you do any sort of make any platform decisions or are going through any transformations. And it is tricky, and it's something that I think we struggle with in the industry. It's not just about the cost savings. That might be an aspect, particularly in a business that has kind of a lot of bloat. But there might actually not be any cost savings.
Intangibles, right? There might be things that you can't measure so well that are definitely worth doing.
Yeah, and I think the other side of the equation that we often miss is what is the value that we're going to create from going through this migration or having this new, say Fabric platform, for example. What do we enable? How do we measure that?
Yeah, that enabling for me is like, well, it's perhaps binary things. It might be intangible, but you can either do it or you can't. And perhaps that is the kind of challenge that a lot of people are facing now with AI and the demand or the opportunity of AI. Like, there are some foundational things. It's probably been said quite a lot that, of course, you need your data available, that knowledge available to be used. And one of the things I think that you were chatting about and sort of observed is that actually the interface to the data or the products, they might be changing and not optimized yet for the way AI will do it. And I wonder if you could share some of your thoughts on that. What do you think products look like or data looks like when everything's AI led?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to know, right? We've got to put our future looking hats on here, but I think we're kind of seeing software engineering leading the way here. A lot of the disruption that we're seeing is on the development side. So there's products like AMP, Cursor, even GitHub Copilot. I mean, that's kind of ancient now, but you've got basically software engineers disrupting themselves, and as part of that, what they're doing is changing the way that their workflow, and they're changing the way that they're structuring their code base so that the AI can better support that, and it can do more.
Yeah.
I think for agentic AI, and it's kind of the buzzword of the year, but for that to kind of really come in play a huge part in other domains, I think it's a case of rethinking the way that things are done, just like the engineers are doing now. They're changing how they're working and their whole workflow
in response to how they want it to be. Yeah.
If we're going to do it in ops, if we're going to do it in finance, it's the same thing. It's the current workflow requires these different tools. That's great for a human, but that's difficult, right? Even though we have MCP now, where we can connect agents to all these tools, that might not be optimal for a way that an agent would do it. And I think that
exactly
the trade-off really then becomes, if you make it so optimized for AI, can we still see the process and understand the process in a way that it's auditable?
So definitely agree with that. But that strikes me that one of the reasons that software development is iterating fast is because of a lot of people who are motivated to make their job simpler and understand it. So you've got a kind of a coupling of the two things. And I think that's the point you're making, that if you're going to optimize operations, you sort of have that same problem that has been with us in software engineering or IT for a very long time, that you might have people who understand what the process is, but don't necessarily understand the art of the possible of the technology to achieve process optimization. And AI, to a degree, is lowering that barrier and being more connected. But you still need people who are going to focus on doing that and optimizing it for their business, which is, I think, is quite insightful.
Yeah, definitely.
So then on the kind of the what if with AI and perhaps where we end up with it, you had some thoughts that the product interfaces will change, the way people work will change, and when you mentioned that actually it might not be auditable and visible what's happening anymore, I suppose like one of my key things about technology has always been that there should be code, like there should be code behind it. There should be sort of progression from user interface to code. And I feel like that is even more true in this space. If you're going to have an AI optimize something, there needs to be a representation of what it's done that you can understand. And so these kind of like low code interfaces, I find them quite troubling that that's almost stopping the AI innovation. Whereas if you had the code and the user interface, or you had the code and the AI, and I see that in data and in business, and maybe that becomes more and more code based is sort of one of my thoughts. I wonder if you have a sort of perception of that yourself. Like what do you think I would prefer, or for an organization to describe as data? You mentioned a couple of tools earlier as well, like the way ThoughtSpot manages things and the way they kind of
I think it's kind of exciting. I think particularly specifically in the data analytics space, what ThoughtSpot are kind of aiming to achieve with it. It's going back to that idea of having too many dashboards. I think the future looks like less dashboards, certainly, but I think even lesser reliance on dashboards. Now, particularly for a power user, maybe they've got a handful of dashboards with a whole load of filters, and they've got to turn all these dials to answer their questions that they have in their head. Having an interface that's more conversational, I think is kind of where we're going, where the AI understands the context, and I think the context is key, right? It understands this person, what their role is, and then obviously they can input a question, and it can produce a graph or a table or whatever makes sense to answer that specific question without the need for the user to go and change a bunch of filters on the dashboard.
Yeah,
But,
exactly. More time in the product. And actually, we mentioned ThoughtSpot, but I recorded the episode 2 with Ollie from Count, and I really like what they're doing in their kind of BI space and thinking about the way AI integrates with it. And actually, you had a classic quote that it's probably the product with the least ROI because there's so much energy and effort goes into that final mile, but that's probably not where the most value is generated. And it's really interesting. Really interesting.
yeah,
point.
I mean, like there's a bunch of cool products there in use cases, but it really comes down to having the foundations right. You've got to, but for those models to get the right context and to get the right answer, you need the data model correctly. You need the right metadata. You need to really ensure that's in a real clean, hygienic place before you can layer those things on top and expect any good sort of output from it.
Yeah. Well, I think then probably that's a good point to wrap things up. And you're probably picking one of the most exciting times to enter this kind of fractional space and this opportunity to help lots and lots of teams. I wonder then if you'd like to share a few parting thoughts on what you think teams could be doing differently and how you think their focus could be over the next 12 months. Maybe a little opportunity to sort of pitch how you might help someone if they were to introduce you into the business.
Yeah, I think maybe just a kind of thought for leaders. It's reframing things, right? It's not which tool to buy, or it's not to throw AI at the business. Do you know what decisions that you need to make to move the business forward? And let's build a solution with the technology, with the data that's going to help you deliver that.
Yeah. I think that's a sound advice, probably for the ages, not just even the next 12 months. So, thanks, Phil. Thanks for coming on. I really enjoyed the conversation and touched on quite a few things that I think will help a lot of people there. So, yeah, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome.
Cheers.
Well, that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening. Brought to you by Matatika, the simpler, smarter data platform. Data Matters aims to share the latest technology directions and your experiences in modern data. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not hit the follow button and stay up to date with new episodes as they're released. Finally, if you feel the episode could benefit someone you know, please share it with them. We're always on the lookout for guests with interesting experiences to share. This has been Data Matters. I've been Aaron Phethean, your host, and until next time, bye for now.